Well, fine, good afternoon all. This is Patricia and I am traveling for history. I am at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum today, and this is the LOIS McCLURE. Now this is let me tell you a bit about her and then some other information you will want to know. And all the information I'm providing is from the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum's website. The quote, "The schooner LOIS McCLURE is the museum's full-scale replica of an 1862 class sailing canal boat based on two shipwrecks located in Lake Champlain. This replica project was initiated in 2001 with the goal to understand our region's unique 1862 class sailing canal schooner, how it was built and operated, and the economic, cultural, and personal impact the canals had on our region and people. After 20 years of service, the replica canal schooner LOIS McCLURE will be retired in October 2023. The LOIS McCLURE has been an important teaching tool of the museum, and this final stage of the replica project gives us the opportunity to explore how canal boat owners would have evaluated, repaired, and retired their own canal boats in our past. In addition, over the next 2 seasons, we will be documenting the entirety of this project through an archiving project including archaeological evaluations, oral histories, testimonials, and more to truly evaluate and understand the impact of this replica and our region's sailing canal boat history. Let's talk about the building of this vessel, shall we? Quote, "Construction of LOIS McCLURE began in earnest in 2002 at the Lake Champlain Transportation Company's Burlington shipyard, shortly after the building of her tender, Mac. Starting with a set of 1842 plans and 2 shipwrecks in Burlington Harbor, the museum turned to a talented group of naval architects, historians, and archaeologists. Both General Butler and O.J. Walker have been studied and documented." On a side note, those are the 2 shipwrecks they were talking about. These reports were handed over to naval architect Ron A. Smith to combine the earlier plans with the shipwreck reports to create the plans necessary to build LOIS McCLURE. Shipwrights Paul Rollins, Rob Thompson, Steve Page, and Liana Tennell headed up the large team of volunteers and staff who spent 3 seasons constructing the schooner while keeping the space open for visitors to view the work in progress. The hull was built from more than 20,000 feet of white oak. White pine was used for the decks, while masts, booms, and gaff were hewn from white spruce. This wood was nearly all local. White spruce from Vermont, white oak from Vermont and New York, pine from Vermont and Maine, cedar from Maine, and even recycled mahogany from NASA. But our greatest resource, and still is, our volunteers. Over 10,000 hours of time were donated by our tireless volunteers to build and interpret this fascinating vessel. The schooner is named in honor of LOIS McCLURE, who, along with her husband Mac, has been a major contributor to this and many other worthy community projects in the greater Burlington, Vermont area. Here are the specs of the LOIS McCLURE. It is 88 feet long. The beam is 14.5 feet. Cargo capacity is 4,400 cubic feet. Cargo weight, 60 to 120 tons. And the sail plan, the mainsail, is 1,309 square feet. The foresail is 768 square feet. And the jib is 196 square feet. All right, well, now we're going to get on board and meet up with Jack, who will be our tour guide, and looking forward to that greatly. So, let us go.
As you probably already know, this is the LOIS McCLURE. It is a replica sailing canal boat, which is a unique type of boat that operated on Lake Champlain over the course of the entire 19th century. It sort of dominated mercantile shipping over the course of the tail end of the 18th and much of the 19th century up until late 1800s, when steam power really took over in a large way. And what makes this design special and what makes it unique to Lake Champlain is that this is essentially a convertible. It is both a canal boat and a sailing ship. You'll see up here we have a bunch of timbers laid. These are the masts for this ship, and in its current condition it is set up in its canal boat configuration. So it has no means of independent propulsion. You would be moving up a canal, hooked up to a team of mules or to a tug, depending on the individual canal, depending on what era you're operating in. Certainly in the early 19th century, it's more mule power, or even sometimes teams of people pulling tugs along the side. Pulling lines along the side of canals to get boats through them. Definitely in the later 19th century, they would have tugs operating that would pull boats through canals, especially after canals had been widened and could accommodate larger ships. But on open water, you would pop these masts up, you would rig up some sails, and continue under your own power. And that is what really made these boats uniquely suited to Lake Champlain, because Lake Champlain, up until the early 1900s, was essentially a mercantile shipping highway for the Northeast, connecting Canada and several major ports in eastern Canada to New York City. Any number of ports around Lake Champlain. And so these ships would operate out of either New York City, Quebec City, Montreal, or any of the larger ports on Lake Champlain: Burlington, Plattsburgh, St. Albans, Whitehall. And they would travel up and down the lake, in and out of canals that connect the lake to other waterways, both in the south and in the north. There is a canal up north that ties into the St. Lawrence that you can use to get up into Canadian waters, and there is a canal down south that ties into the Hudson that you can use to get into New York City. They would go back and forth, taking stuff from Canada down to New York and vice versa, and switching the configuration of the ship as needed. You would go through a canal in the canal boat configuration, make it back out onto open water on the lake, pop a sail up, travel all the way down the length of the lake, hit another canal, drop the mast down, and continue on as a canal boat. Offload your cargo, pick up some more, do the same trip in the opposite way.
What kind of things would they trade?
Anything and everything. Textiles, lumber, iron ore, worked industrial goods, cookware. We have, I think the specific number's a little shaky because some of the boats are decomposed to the point where we can't quite tell what they were, but we have for sure over 100 wrecks in the lake that are identifiable as the same type or a very similar design as the LOIS McCLURE, same type of sort of mercantile shipping, sailing canal boat, and we have found evidence of cargo in several of those of just all sorts. We have one very nearby just across the lake on the New York side in one of the harbors over there that is full of stoves and sort of cookware.
Wow.
We have one that's just full of quarried stone, these big stone blocks. That actually make that one pretty easy to dive on because you can get down there and just sort of pull yourself along these massive, I'm talking like maybe this big across, this tall blocks of stone that are occupying the entire top deck.
How did the boat hold that much weight?
That one did, which is why
clearly yes, it did sink.
Yeah.
Duh, okay.
And people are people, you make mistakes. That one, that one was holding that much weight because it didn't have crew. That one was, we call it a Diamond Island stone boat because it's sunk off a place called Diamond Island and it's full of stone. And it was in its canal boat configuration, hooked up via a couple lines to a convoy of other canal boats being pulled by one larger steamboat. And they made additional space on board to hold that much weight by getting rid of the crew, getting rid of any of the stuff that would go along with the crew, food, supplies, whatnot. It was just an empty boat being pulled along by a single crew thing, and that boat eventually winds up going down because one of the lines snaps, gives way, unties, we're not sure. The boat drifts on its own with no means of propulsion and no one to propel it, and then runs up against some rocks, gets swamped by some waves, we're not entirely sure which, and winds up at the bottom.
Mamma mia. So for the one that had stoves on it, has anyone brought any of those items up?
We haven't personally, but we are constantly, as an institution, running into people who will email us, call us, send us letters saying, like, my father, my mother, my grandmother just passed away, and we found in her, like we're going through and organizing the estate, we found like all this stuff that came off the bottom of the lake. There are amateur divers operating in, there have been amateur divers operating in Lake Champlain for 50, 60, 70 years, up through, I mean, since the 50s, 60s, 70s is really when it picks up. That is what led to the foundation of this museum in the first place. Our founder was one such amateur diver who wound up with a pretty large collection of cool stuff he had taken off the bottom of the lake and needed somewhere to house it. There we go, museum.
Yay!
But we are pretty consistently encountering historical artifacts and whatnot that just random people around the Lake Champlain watershed have found, sort of stumbled their way into having. And we don't know if anything specifically off that boat has come to us, but we found certainly some cookware, pots and pans, never a whole stove. Those are down there. That, I mean, you would need a little more than most people have access to resource-wise.
Cast iron?
Yeah, you would need a crane, some kind of barge to get those up. But yeah, it's all down there, and that's pretty much our policy with regards to shipwrecks. You, especially in Lake Champlain and in colder fresh water, it's typically better for the preservation of an individual wreck to leave it in the water where it is. Because the second you take it out of the water, it starts drying out, and that process can be catastrophic for wooden wrecks in particular. It'll just start flaking away and disintegrating, basically. And Lake Champlain, we're lucky that it is cold enough and it's fresh water, so you don't have salinated water causing like serious rust issues on metal wrecks, and you don't have other sort of bacteria that thrive in salt water that can make some wrecks in the ocean and in sort of larger inland seas really start to fall apart quickly. We've kind of got, if you've heard of the sort of Lake Superior effect, they say that Lake Superior never gives up her dead if you go down there, because it's so cold that bacteria that kickstart decomposition both in human bodies and in other organic material like wood don't really exist in any large numbers down there. Lake Champlain, not as extreme, has a similar thing going where it's deep enough and it's cold enough down near the bottom that a lot of these wrecks are being preserved pretty well down there, definitely better than they would be if we were to take them out of the water. And so there have been a couple wrecks raised out of Lake Champlain. Most of them have not fared too well. There's one that's doing pretty okay, but it's doing pretty okay because it's in the Smithsonian and the national government is pouring millions of dollars into keeping it that way. And so an institution like us, we just don't have the resources to dredge up these wrecks or too many things out of them. And we generally consider it better that they're down there in the first place, because that allows us to do historical work on them, on the location. We dive down there, we take video, we take photos, we use those videos and photos to build 3D models, computerized models that allow us to explore the entire wreck and teach on it and make historical work happen, basically.
Wow, that seems insane. I just teach computer skills, and that still sounds insane. Yeah, it's advanced stuff. We work with some very talented people who are good at photogrammetry and 3D modeling to piece together models of these wrecks and to get the material that we need to piece together those models in the first place. We have a small fleet. We have 3 underwater drones. Well, those are small. That's a small fleet.
It's a small fleet.
Yeah.
It's multiple. That counts.
Yes.
We have a couple underwater drones and a few experienced divers on our staff who go down and each season. Each summer and fall is actually prime diving season in Lake Champlain, because there is, I forget the exact word, but there's a lake effect, lake weather effect that happens where the temperature of the water, which you would think is typically warmer up near the top and colder down near the bottom because it's closer to the sun. There's something specific about Lake Champlain which escapes me at this point because it's not typically part of this tour, that around September every year that flips and the water becomes warmer the deeper you go.
Wow.
And so late September, October, early November is actually prime time for diving deeper wrecks in Lake Champlain because you're going to be more comfortable down there.
Wow.
And so we do a lot of our archaeological work in the late summer, early fall, going down there, diving wrecks, and getting footage, documenting things.
Wow.
And a lot of those wrecks are sailing canal boats, which is how we got this boat in the first place. This is this whole replica design is based off of a composite of several sailing canal boat wrecks, all of which we've tentatively classified as the 1862 class of sailing canal boats. They're actually fairly easy to date, approximately, as historical artifacts because the canals that they move through necessitate certain things in terms of boat design. You can't have a boat that is wider than the canal that it's designed to travel through. And because of, just pure common sense, the canals that connect Lake Champlain, both up north and down south, are pretty uniform. They are both historically kept in similar dimensions to one another. And so this boat is, I believe, 13 and a half feet long, 13 and a half feet wide, rather. And that allows us to, if, say, this were a wreck that we had just found at the bottom of the lake, and we determined that, oh, this wreck is 13 and a half feet wide, that allows us to say, okay, this wreck is of a ship that was constructed and active after 1862, because in 1862, the canals on either end of the lake were expanded as part of a public works project that made them 14 feet wide, as opposed to the 13 feet wide that they were before. And when that happens, people start making boats that are 13 and a half feet wide to maximize space, because every single bit of square footage that you can get inside these ships is more cargo you can bring, that's more profit that you're turning, it's more money flowing into your bank account. And so we're able to date these ships pretty approximately, but reliably, based off of their dimensions, because they have to line up with the dimensions of the canal. If it's wider than, if we find a 13 and a half foot boat, and someone's saying that that's from the 1850s, we can say reliably that no, it wasn't, because it wouldn't have fit through the canal as it existed at that time. And so this is a replica of an 1862 class sailing canal boat. Constructed, first laid down in 2001, construction finished in 2004. Constructed using a mix of modern tools applied to historical methods, and it is now at the end of what is, at this point, a near 20-year career on the lake as a living history exhibit. Between 2004 and 2018, I believe, was the last tour. It was on near annual tours around the lake and surrounding waterways.
So it was actually moving,
yes,
under
yes.
sail.
So the first tour just went in 2004, just after the boat was finished, just went up to St. Albans and back, stayed up there for about a week, floating on the water. People were able to get on the boat, talk to museum staff, learn about history, and yada, yada, yada.
All that great stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And then in 2005, we had enough lead-up time and an actual finished boat to put together a larger well-to-do to commemorate the launch of this ship. And so we had what we call the Grand Tour, that went all the way down to New York City. We went up to Burlington, across the lake there, down the New York side, stopping off at port towns here and there for a few days at a time. And then eventually down to New York City, where the boat spent, I think, a week in a slip along the Hudson, as a living history exhibit down there, teaching people in New York about the history of their waterways and whatnot. And that was the pattern that we followed for the rest of the boat's existence, basically every year, occasionally every 2 years. We would pick a new destination and construct a tour that would stop off at a lot of points before they hit that destination, stay there for a week, 2 weeks, have the boat staffed by museum staff and volunteers who would then just sort of operate it as a living history exhibit on location, and then bring it back, do the same thing on the way back.
Wow.
And as I said, that happened from 2004 all the way up until 2018, at which point the boat sprung a leak that we were working on fixing.
Wow.
And then COVID happened.
Oh, COVID, yes.
Yes. So the boat hasn't gone out on any officially planned tours since 2018, because as I said, we were repairing it between 2018 and 2019, and then we were working on putting together a potential tour for 2020, and then COVID happened. And it's been sitting here at the docks pretty much ever since. We move it in the winter to Basin Harbor, which is a neighboring harbor, and they have a climate control system for the interior of their harbor that essentially circulates water and keeps it from freezing over.
Wow.
And we have a good relationship with the Basin Harbor Club, and so they allow us to keep the LOIS there during the winter in a place where the water doesn't freeze over and it won't damage the boat. But that's for the past couple of years that's all the movement that the boat has done, just moving next door and then moving back over in the spring. And in that time, I mean, these boats historically were able to tell had a working life of 10 to 15 years. And as I said, this is coming up on 20, so we are nearing the end of her natural life. We're beyond the end of her natural life, really. And so you start to run into, I mean, I'm sure you'll see there are bits of rot in the deck and in the sides of the ship, which is just, I mean, that's, it comes with the territory when you have a wooden ship in water. And so we are currently in the process of transferring ownership of the boat to the New York Canal Society, who have found some money and some people who are willing to turn it into an on-land exhibit to allow it to be preserved in a more stable state.
Wow.
For years to come. I mean, hopefully in perpetuity.
So sort of like the Philadelphia 2.
Sort of like the Philadelphia 2, as I'm sure you saw coming down. This is going to be in a much better state than the Philadelphia 2, because the reason the Philadelphia 2 is up there is because it sank.
What sank?
Yes. Because of similar reasons. I mean, it's not a terribly long-lasting design in the first place. The Philadelphia 2 is kind of a ad hoc, slapped-together design. I mean, the Philadelphia originally was a boat built by people who didn't know how to build boats. They were carpenters. They knew how to work wood. They didn't know how to build boats, specifically. And so if the Philadelphia hadn't been sunk by the British, it would have been sunk by itself eventually, as our replica proves. And so the LOIS is going to be in a much better state on land, but it is going to be an on-land exhibit along the same lines as the Philadelphia 2, in the hopes that it doesn't go the same way as the Philadelphia 2 eventually, because the longer we leave it on the water, the more likely something like that is going to happen, and we don't want to see that happen, obviously. So we are working on turning it into an on-land exhibit.
That's exciting.
Yeah. And New York Canal Society is going to take over ownership and establish an on-land exhibit at one of their exhibit spaces on the other side of the lake. They have museum spaces all across the lake and all across the Erie Canal and other waterways. And after, I think we've finally decided that tomorrow is going to be the last day that she's open for the public at the lake.
It's tomorrow.
Yes.
It's not the 30th, it's the 20th. What's today?
Today's the 20th.
So it's not actually the 30th, so the 29th is the last day.
I believe.
Okay.
I believe so. It could be the 30th. That's in flux because after that point is when the New York Canal Society officially takes ownership of the boat and we go full hands off. And it's our responsibility to provide them with all the resources they need to make the transfer to the other side of the lake into their own spaces, but they're going to be handling all the logistics and hands-on work with the boat from that point on. and there's been some discussion with them about whether they want to do that on Saturday or Sunday or even later on, and yada yada yada. So tentatively we've been telling people the 29th in case that the boat is not available on the 30th.
Okay, fair enough.
And yeah, I mean, as I say, from there, we're not entirely sure what specifically is going to happen. We know that by mid-October it's going to be on the other side of the lake, being prepared to be turned into an on-land exhibit, but the specific logistics of how and when it is going to get over there are still under discussion. Yeah.
Wow. So, will she be sailed?
Yes, yeah, that much we do know. It's just a matter of what route they're going to take, who is going to crew it, and when specifically that is going to be happening, which is all stuff that's in process, and we have promising progress being made on all those things. It's just a matter of actually hammering out the details. But yeah, it's going to be, if not sailed over there, because, I mean, this is all stuff that hasn't been used for going on 5 years now.
It kind of looks it.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry about that from here.
And the LOIS worked in concert with a tugboat, a more modern tugboat called the Churchill, for the entirety of her life. Historically, these boats were entirely wind-powered, but if you are operating a meticulously scheduled whistle-stop tour of the entire lake every summer, you need to be hitting dates in a more reliable way than wind power allows you to. And so on all these tours for the entirety of her life, she would be accompanied by the Churchill, and we would sail her whenever we could, but whenever we couldn't, we would hook up to the Churchill and she would be pulled along the lake and so in order to hit those dates that we had set up. Be in this town by this time for this many days, this town by this time for this many days, and so on and so forth. And so we just on Tuesday officially signed the paperwork to transfer the Churchill to the New York Canal Society, and over the past couple days they've been looking it over, making sure it's seaworthy, familiarizing their people with the boat, and the Churchill is going to be pulling the LOIS McCLURE across the lake for the majority of the way, is my understanding.
Wow. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this is the top deck, because we can give you the full tour of the boat now. This is the main deck. They would, when the boat was fully loaded, they would use every single bit of space they possibly could, and that includes filling this deck as much as possible. They would tie stuff down in pretty precarious stacks at time, and I mean, we found historical records of ships that were so laden that they didn't leave walkways even for the crew.
They climb over them?
You'd climb over the cargo. You would make your way through it in whatever way possible.
Wow.
And that extends to sleeping quarters. There's only one actual bespoke living area aboard the ship, and that was reserved for the captain and the captain's family. The crew, if the boat wasn't fully loaded, would string hammocks either between these spars here or, I mean, anywhere they could get them set up in the below decks areas.
Wow. And these aren't right here, spars?
Yes, and they serve as the foundations for the masts.
Okay.
When the masts pop up, basically, think of them as the trunks of those trees. You need something that is a little more sturdy and permanent to mount the mast to. Otherwise, it's not going to be able to take the weight of the wind pushing against it. And so they would string hammocks along there. Or below decks, but if the ship's fully loaded, you would be sleeping on, around, or in the cargo. And I mean, if you're lucky, you're hauling sacks of flour, or textiles, or something soft. If you're unlucky, it's lumber, iron ore, stoves.
Or that marble.
Yeah, or that marble. And you just got to make do. But show you the main cargo hold. Down this way.
All right.
And
All right. So
are a little sketchy. Yeah.
So for my audience here, I'm going to pause this video. So until I get to the bottom of the stairs, I'll take a picture of this so you can see how steep it is, and then we'll continue the tour.
The boat was retired, chop it up into pieces, and turn it into a sort of segmented on-land exhibit. And part of the impetus for that rumor was people complaining that the boat wasn't at all accessible, which it isn't. And that would allow you to make it more accessible. That wasn't ever an actual plan under discussion, but part of the idea of getting it on land is making it more accessible to the public, which we will be able to do once we can attach ramps and lifts and other things to it. But this is the main cargo hold. We have some mock bits of cargo in here to give you a sense of what it would look like. I want you to go ahead and imagine this filling the entire space, dependent on the ambitions of the individual captain. You would fill this more or less, but typically up against the walls here, it would be floor to ceiling, even a little higher than this, depending on just like what kind of cargo you were working with. Sometimes they would leave a walkway open like this. More often than not, they would stack cargo up to about this height all the way across, and the crew would have to crouch or crawl over the top of it to make their way through here. Because the more stuff you have atop one of these boats, the more stuff you have packed into one of these boats, the more tonnage you're moving, more money you're making. And
do we have an idea from any sort of records about how much they could make? Depending upon the wares, of course.
So I can tell you that it was good money. It was enough that these crews weren't mutinying all the time. I don't have specific numbers off the top of my head, but it was decent money. It would be enough that you would tolerate sleeping on cargo for the entire time, the entire voyage. And the more stuff you're moving, the more money you're making. So the crew would be, blue collar workers are the same across all time. You will tolerate a lot of stuff for a little extra cash.
Yes.
And so they would stack things as high as they could. You can see down here, there are these little holes in the floor. That is for hooks that you would use to pull up these planks and reveal a deeper cargo hold below.
Good Lord.
Some of which is occupied by ballast at all times, and then the rest of it would be filled up with cargo.
Wow. But how much more space would they gain?
Not a whole lot, but every little bit counts. As I told you, they were redesigning these boats to add 6 inches of space on either side, and that for them seemed like a worthwhile investment. You would gain maybe a couple square feet, not all that much, but enough to fit in a couple extra sacks of sugar, a couple extra sacks of grain, some more.
And money is money.
Packed cotton, wool, money is money. Watch your step here. Centerboard does run along here. This is actually that's the housing for the centerboard that they would drop in when they raise the mast. Sailing vessels, as you may know, when they have a mast, they also have a long board that extends from the bottom of the ship down to act as a counterbalance, so that there is something providing resistance in the water when the wind is pushing the ship this way and that, so that it doesn't just fully tip right over.
I did not know that, but that's very interesting, and it makes sense.
Yeah, and so you could unscrew a couple of these, pop that open, drop in a centerboard, pop that down.
Wow. So then, so they would undo all of this, let the centerboard come up?
Yes, and we haven't undone it for several years, which is why it looks like that.
Okay. This kind of reminds me of the Ticonderoga at the Shelburne Museum, because they have things on board to show. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Same idea. And up in here, I apologize, there's another iffy staircase. You can actually get a pretty good view of this from the base of the stairs as well, if you like.
Oh, let me just pause it again, so if you...
Sorry. Here we have the primary accommodations for the captain and his family. Captains would, it was entirely, it was pretty common actually that captains would bring their families along on boats of this kind on the lake, because the voyages were just in the sweet spot of short enough that you could bring your family along, and long enough that you didn't want to be away from them for that amount of time that they would. And you can see in here there are these platforms that they would put mattresses over. They pop up so you can store bedding, clothes, personal effects, all sorts of stuff like that. We have additional additional storage along here with cupboards and all sorts of things like that. There's a little pantry along this wall, a table, a stove. They have a washboard. You got gas lights. This is fine living as far as mercantile shipping in the 19th century is concerned.
So like an RV.
Mm-hmm. And the captain's family would live in here in relative comfort compared to the crew. And you can see there is a little stairway and a hatch there that connects to the main deck that would allow the captain and his family to come and go from the top deck without having to move through the cargo hold, both for their own comfort and to keep them out of the way of the crew while the ship was underway.
Could the crew ever use this, or?
I mean, they would every now and again. I mean, if the rules weren't as strict as they are on like Navy vessels regarding enlisted men in officers' quarters and whatnot. I mean, this is more like you're stepping into your boss's office, but your boss's office also happens to be his home. So, I mean, if you need the captain, you would either shout through one of these windows or maybe you'd poke your head in here if something extreme was happening. And you can see here we have these fastened here. This could drop and be stowed if you needed extra space. You just pop that off and pull it on back.
How much cargo would be put back here? Anything?
Nothing if they could help it.
Oh.
But I mean, because a lot of this space was being occupied either by personal effects and things for the comfort of the family and the captain himself, or I mean, as well, they would sometimes use this space for food storage for the crew, food and supplies, because the crew's dinners would be cooked on this stove.
Oh, that makes sense, because we didn't see any of the stoves, did we now?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So would so if the captain's bringing his family, I'm presuming his wife, so would his wife be the one cooking?
Sometimes, depends on the ship. There wasn't really any kind of, I mean, as far as we can tell, there wasn't really any kind of like traditional idea of who should be doing the cooking aboard a vessel like this. We have evidence of some vessels where the crew cooked on a rotation, or if they had one crew member who was like a particularly good cook, they would do that. Sometimes the captain's wife would do it. Really does vary from individual vessel to individual vessel.
Wow.
But yeah, I mean, this is the nicest spot on the ship, pretty much.
And hot.
And
So
hot.
if you're traveling in the spring or the fall, yay, but summertime would be
Yes.
hot.
Yes, exactly, which is why you can just barely see these things here. I mean, these are just for display, but you would be able to flip those down, pop these out, and I mean, these are screens set up in a more summer configuration, but we have pane glass over here set up in a more spring, fall, cold weather configuration. Difference between a storm door and a glass pane door. And they would pop these out and exchange them as far as, weather permitted.
So I know Lake Champlain historically has frozen over.
Yes.
So would they stay? So I'm thinking the waters south of us would not freeze over. Or am I wrong about that?
It depends. The weather in the 19th century was, I mean, a little bit colder than we're talking about here. There was actually, I mean, in the middle of the 19th century, between 1840 and the mid-1850s, there was a small ice age that was actually one of the root causes of the Irish potato famine. But the lake would, with more frequency than today, but with a similar amount of variability, sometimes it would freeze over, sometimes it wouldn't, and you had very little way of, in the summer, predicting what it would be like in the winter. And so they would operate these boats as long as they possibly could, in whatever way they possibly could. If they wind up in a situation where the North Lake freezes and the South Lake doesn't, then guess what? You're running cargo from Whitehall down to New York all along the South Lake for however long you can until weather fails to permit that. They would operate these boats as far into the season as they could until some part of their route froze. Usually that would be the canals first, and then the lake later, but sometimes you run into the opposite situation. But typically, we have record of these boats operating late into November, early December, sometimes all the way into January if the lake doesn't freeze.
Wow.
So, yeah, I mean, this stove would become pretty important at that point.
Absolutely. Wow.
Because they were making some cold runs with these boats for sure. Definitely wasn't the most common way that these boats were used, but they were used during the winter in pretty choppy, stormy, cold seas.
Oh, yuck.
Yeah.
On a side note, because and you may not know this, but to get the cargo, did they have contracts with companies?
Yes. So there were almost no independent shipping vessels on Lake Champlain over the course of the entire 19th century. There were some very early on. Vermont was one of the last of the original 13 colonies to really develop, historically speaking, in terms of mercantile trade and economic development and these sorts of infrastructure developments that you would expect to see facilitating that. Vermont has always had a very small population relative to other places like that, and so while in the era of the Revolutionary War, Massachusetts, for example, already a sort of thriving populous society that is being developed along European lines. They've, by that point, displaced a large number of Native American populations and are building up these large European-style colonial cities in Boston, Amherst, Concord. Vermont, basically one big forest with a bunch of sheep farms in it. And so early on, there is some independent shipping on Lake Champlain in the end of the 18th and early 19th century, but by the 1830s, most of the shipping on the lake is under the auspices of the Champlain Transportation Company, which developed a monopoly on the lake in the late 1820s and early 1830s and continued that monopoly on up into the 1890s. And so a lot of their shipping, by far the majority of the shipping on Lake Champlain was handled by the Champlain Transportation Company. If you had a boat, if you built a boat, you would sell it to them. If you owned a boat independently, they would approach you to buy it, and they would let you captain it under them, but you would be under contract with them. They would own the boat. When you retired, they would keep the boat. And so these boats would operate under contract from a company. They weren't going to different ports of their own volition, stuff like that. They would get contracts from corporate overlords, basically saying, like, we have commissioned an order of such and such harbor, go here, pick it up, bring it here. This is going to be your cut of whatever the profit is, yada, yada, yada. And so that was typically how they operated. Wow,
okay. Wow. It's so funny, when you said the Lake Champlain Transportation Company, yeah, bells.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of, they handled mercantile shipping, they handled passenger shipping. The Ticonderoga at one point was a CTC vessel. Wow. They ran things in the Lake Champlain watershed for a very long time. Between 7 and 8 million. And so if you got a couple spare million lying around, we can get working on it right away. But yeah, it's definitely something we'd like to explore in the future, but we don't have immediate plans because it's a decent chunk of change. It's an undertaking. And we don't have that money lying around right now.
Yeah. Nice. Very nice. Amazing.
Yeah. The reason it's a large amount of that funding came from a private benefactor named LOIS McCLURE, who was just really inspired by the project and decided to chip in a large amount of her considerable fortune. And from there, I am afraid I'm...
All right, so I know we're ending because the tour ends. The tour runs 10:30 to 12.
Yes.
And, all right, so... And I'm sorry, I didn't get your name at the start.
Jack.
Jack. Well, I would like to thank you, Jack, on behalf of my channel and my viewers.
Of course.
And this has been a wonderful tour. I didn't know a lot of this stuff, and I'm sure my viewers are thrilled about that too.
Yeah. glad to help out.
So, are you usually the person who does the tours? Is there a group of people?
We rotate. When we can, we have volunteers who handle all of this. But typically, I mean, over the past couple of years, at least while the boat's been here, it's been open 2 to 3 days a week. This summer we were operating for the large part on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we would try to have it open on Sundays as well. But that was a floating day, depending on whether we could get some staffing for that.
A floating day on a boat.
Yes, no pun intended.
Oh, pun intended is great.
But since she's being retired, we have sort of shifted things around however we needed to make sure that it could be open every single day over the course of the entire month of September, so that people would have a whole month to come and say their goodbyes to the boat. My official title here is I'm the office manager. I'm on the administrative side of things. I'm not usually handling tours or interpretation or anything like that.
Would never know that.
I'm glad to hear it. It means I'm covering for myself correctly. But and yeah, I mean, similarly, my other coworkers, we've had our volunteer and programs manager handling some of the tours. We've had our finance officer handling some of it. Anyone and everyone who has some free time has just been hitting the books, learning the LOIS tour down pat, so that we could get staffing on the boat every single day from 10:30 to 12 over the course of the entire month of September. So I'm not usually the one doing the tour. No, I just have been pulling a couple days here over the past couple months.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh. Is there anything else you'd like to add about this boat before you need to cover someone's lunch?
So, I mean, it kind of speaks for itself, honestly. Yeah, I mean, it's just a really interesting, unique part of Lake Champlain's history. It's a vessel that wouldn't exist anywhere else because it's purpose-built for the environment that we have around us. And I mean, in that way, it's really cool. I'm really glad that we've been able to find a way to make sure that it's going to be preserved, because the preservation process, turning it into an on-land exhibit, is no small undertaking. I told you already, it was a couple million to get the boat built. It would be a couple, I mean, it is going to be a couple more to get it set up at an on-land exhibit. And that's something that we weren't sure we were going to be able to handle as an institution. And so we're really glad that the New York Canal Society was able to step in, find some funding for that, and undertake that project. So we're really happy that it's going to be continuing on as an educational tool for people for generations to come, hopefully.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled about that, too.
Yeah.
So, and for the people in the future who will get to see her.
I know.
Yeah.
So sad that she won't be on the water anymore, but
So she's come to the end of her life
exactly.
on the water.
It is a necessary step that we're going to need to take so that people can continue to appreciate the LOIS for, I mean, as long as possible.
Wow. Alrighty. Well, this is Patricia, and I'm traveling for history. I'd really like to again offer a heartfelt thank you to Jack, who works for the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. Now, if I didn't mention it before, it's free admission, people. And tomorrow, the 29th, is the official last day, though there could be a Saturday tossed in as well. 10:30 to noon.
10:30 to noon.
10:30 to noon. Come on down. Come see it. And I'm thrilled.
Yeah. Keep your eyes on the New York Canal Society. They'll be announcing whenever the LOIS is back open for the public.
Which could be a trip. Who doesn't love a field trip?
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you again. And
thanks. Thank you, viewers.
You're welcome. All right. So until I see you folks again, thanks so much.